It's a privilege to be here this morning here in India, and I know it's afternoon in many other parts of Asia from where you've logged in. So thank you for coming in during your lunchtime in the middle of the day. And for colleagues from this part of Asia, thank you for taking time off from a busy morning, a Tuesday morning, to listen into this webinar. Thank you, Viveka, for this invitation. I think it's a privilege for me to give back to United Board for the immense investment that United Board has made in my life through the Leadership Fellowship Program, the Leaders Fellow Program. And I think it's only too fitting that I'm here today to share some of my experiences with you. So thank you for this opportunity again. Before we start, a couple of maybe not housekeeping rules, but tips that can help make this webinar effective for you. If you are old-fashioned like me, it might be useful to have a piece of paper or a notebook with you in front of you so that you can take down some notes, because this session is going to be fairly a reflective session. I'm not going to give you a lot of content, but there are some questions that I want you to think about. So if you have a piece of paper with you and a pen around you, that will be useful. It's also great if you have your phones with you and your camera on. You can take a snapshot of some of the slides that I'm going to place before you, because these are questions that you might want to reflect on as we do this session together. The title of my presentation is Neglect to Nurture, and we will be speaking and reflecting together this afternoon, this morning, on emotional well-being and leadership. There are several questions that we can address in a webinar like this, but there are two key questions that I would like to address and talk through this time of reflection. And it's not the first question that you see on the PowerPoint over there, because the first question has been answered well in literature. If you're going to Google and if you type in wellness and emotion and leadership, or emotional wellness and leadership, or benefits of emotional wellness and leadership, you will see hundreds of hits. And it has been proved beyond reasonable doubt that emotional wellness impacts leadership positively in many ways: productivity, quality of life, better team engagement, engagement with the institution, longevity, better health, and so on. So I'm not going to build an argument about the benefits of emotional wellness for the team. That's been made very well. The questions that I would like to focus on this afternoon, this morning, is why do leaders who are otherwise caring persons care less for themselves? Why do we neglect our well-being? And there's enough research to show that among groups of people who neglect their well-being, two groups of people stand out: leaders, parents. And the third group are those in the helping professions: leaders, parents, and those in helping professions. A second question that we will be reflecting through this webinar is why, although we are intellectually endowed, I can see that we have presidents in today's webinar, we have deans, we have department chairs, we have leaders from great institutions in Asia and around the world. We know a lot about wellness. We know a lot about what we should do about our emotional health and our physical health, but we hardly practice these habits. So through this webinar, I'm going to talk through some of these questions, and I hope that at the end of this webinar, we'll have some handles on how we can break that pattern of knowing about the importance of well-being and not doing anything about it. I've also positioned or framed this webinar with content from evidence-based models. What do I mean by that? Viveka introduced me as someone who worked with the Department of Psychology, and I continue to do that for many years. And there is a lot of psychology out there. If you type into Google wellness and mental health or something like that, you will see thousands of blog posts, websites, and so on. But I would like to work with you on what I call as evidence-based models, models from psychology and mental health that seem to work well with people across any diverse group. Secondly, this webinar is constructed around the philosophy of whole person education or whole person philosophy. Leadership is not seen as something separate from what we otherwise do. I am many things in my life. I'm a parent, I'm a husband, I'm a brother, I'm a son, I'm a sibling, I'm a leader, I'm a teacher, I'm a Christian, I'm many things in my life. And I don't normally differentiate my leadership from these other aspects of my life. And I think it's important for all of us to understand that leadership should not be separated from other aspects of our life. Because one of the challenges in taking care of our emotional wellness is because we precisely do that. And I will speak more about that as we go along. A third point that I want to state in terms of the construction of this webinar, and I've said that already, is that this webinar is built around points of reflection. And I have 4 points of reflection that I would like to share with all of you today. So let's dive in now to the first point of reflection that I want to place before you. And this would be a good time if you have your camera or if you have your piece of paper, because this slide has a couple of points more than what we would normally put in a webinar. So you might want to kind of take down notes just for this slide. There are truths about leadership that impact emotional wellness. And let me introduce this point for you by taking a metaphor from parenting. I could see from the chat box today that I could kind of infer that several of you here in this webinar today are parents. And one of the questions that parents always grapple with is, why are my children not appreciative of the things that I do for them? Well, research tells us that children will not appreciate the efforts and sacrifices of parents until they are much older. You really need to get into your late 20s and your early 30s and perhaps even into your 40s before you really start to understand the sacrifices that parents have done for us. That's a truth about parenting. Let me introduce some truths about leadership for you. Truth number 1, leaders cannot please everyone despite working in the best interest of the organization. It's just not possible for us to do that. And several of you great leaders out there in the webinar, I think you can resonate with this particular truth about leadership. It's great to be a leader, but it's not possible to please everybody. Truth number 2, leaders do not receive rewards from those they lead. If I'm leading a department, I'm leading a school, I'm leading an institution, I can't expect those who I'm leading to reward me for what I do, despite caring for their welfare. That's truth number 2. Truth number 3, we are surrounded by people most of the time. Most of us, I know in the institutions that are part of the United Board network, we all believe in the value of community, and we're always surrounded by people, by our peers, by those whom we report to, by those whom we work for. But yet, we go through several moments of loneliness. In fact, loneliness is a hallmark of leadership. Leadership is a lonely journey, and those of us who've been part of the United Board's fellow program know that very well, and how we create support groups among ourselves to deal with that loneliness. Truth number 4, leaders think and invest in their teams, but will not form beautiful relationships with everyone in their team. In other words, it's not possible for a leader to be good friends with everyone in your team. Truth number 5, leaders plan for the organization and its growth, but the team will not always understand the reasons for their actions. So in some sense, leaders are not always understood fully by those we lead. And that is a truth about leadership that we need to contend with. Finally, truth number 6, leaders are de facto expected to be role models. So the moment I'm a dean or a department chair or a president or a vice chancellor, people are looking at me, and therefore I have to function in a certain role that sometimes takes me away from my humanity. So there you are, 6 truths about leadership that should lay the ground for what I'm going to speak to you next. If these are truths about leadership, it means that these are truths that we have to contend with while being a leader. However, there is something that comes in the way of accepting these truths. If you wear your intellectual hats right now and look at each of the truths that I placed before you on this PowerPoint, you're likely to agree with me that they are true and that, that's how leadership is. Yes, I can't please everybody. I know that right in my head. However, we are also human beings, and we have what are known as competing personal beliefs. And the first reflection point for you about emotional wellness that I want to place for you to think about is this: our personal beliefs always compete with truths about leadership, leading to negative emotional responses. Let me state that for you a little more clearly. I spoke about a leadership truth. For example, leaders cannot please everyone despite working for the interests of the organization. While this is a truth, there is always a competing personal belief that emerges from the person of the leader. I need to win the approval of my team and my superiors. Remember, we are humans first, leaders second. It's never the other way around, even if you want to think that way. Right? Humans first, leaders second. So if I need to win the approval of my team and my superiors, that competes with the leadership truth. Another example, leaders do not receive rewards from those they lead despite caring for their welfare. What's a competing personal belief here? I need to be rewarded or appreciated for my work. You see, personal competing beliefs often compete with leadership truths, leading to unhelpful negative emotional responses. So you can take each of the 6 leadership truths that I placed for you earlier and then work out some of your own competing personal beliefs. So if you have your notebook or your journal with you this afternoon, you might want to do that perhaps after this webinar or while the webinar is going on. Ask yourself, what are some of the personal beliefs of mine that compete with leadership truths? And this is what happens when that competition pans out. It leads to what I call as negative emotional responses: disappointments, frustrations, sadness, self-doubt, and the list goes on. So if I'm expecting the approval of my team and my superiors all the time, and that drives me and I don't receive it, because the truth of leadership is that we are not always going to receive that approval, then I might end up being frustrated. And that is one of the sources of poor emotional health. So that's the first reflection point that I want to leave with you this morning, this afternoon. This morning and afternoon is quite tricky, right? When you speak to people from around the world. Which of your personal beliefs are competing with leadership truths and leave you with negative emotions? Think about that I'm going to pause for a couple of seconds here to give you some time to reflect and think, just for maybe 10 or 15 seconds. And if you have a piece of paper with you, or if you just want to make a mental note and you want to go back to these 6 leadership truths that I placed for you, you might want to ask yourself if there are competing personal beliefs that are constantly at war with these truths. So that's the first reflection that I want to leave with you today. Let me go into the second part of my presentation. I want to give you a framework about why leaders kind of feel emotionally depleted or low on resources and energy. You know, this war between your competing beliefs and leadership truths, all that happens in a part of the human brain which is called the prefrontal cortex. And I don't want to make this a science lecture for you this morning, but I think it's important for us to have a handle on why we spend a lot of time in poor emotional health. The prefrontal cortex is right here. So if you consider the development of the human brain as the palm of my hand, and I hope you can see that, as the brain evolves, the brain folds up like this, and then as you are born and as you grow older, the The outer part of the brain covers you, and right in the front, you have what is called as the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex actually protects us in some sense, because that's the seat for decision making, judgment, thinking, regulating your emotions, and so on. There's a lot of activity that is going on in the prefrontal cortex right now. So if I can get some of you who are listening to my webinar today and place your heads into an MRI machine or a computer scanner or a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and if you're really processing and reflecting about what I'm talking to you about today, then you're likely to see activation in the prefrontal cortex. So normally you would see, brain scans like this. This is a brain scan of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's not about leaders, although for some leaders, leadership can be traumatic. And I know that because very recently, because of the COVID, I know that some of our network universities had to lay off employees. We've lost jobs, we've had salary cuts, and there have been a lot of unpleasant situations. And some of our employees and friends have gone through trauma. But that aside, if you look at this slide here, you'll notice that if your brain is more active and processing negative emotions, then a lot of your prefrontal cortex and the cortex becomes active. What this means is that the brain is spending a lot of time consuming calories and energy. On an average, the brain consumes 20 to 30% of calories. But for somebody who's constantly thinking, developing, dilemmas in your mind like leaders do, competing between personal beliefs and leadership truths, the amount of calories that we spend is a lot. Research tells us that the brain spends more energy and resource processing negative emotions than positive. So if something goes wrong in the webinar today, chances are that I will think about that much more than the good things that come out of this webinar. And that's important for us as leaders, because the more we spend time on negative and emotional responses in our lives, our energies get depleted. The metaphor that I've placed for you on this slide is the metaphor of a water tank. And the water tank is all your emotional reserve. And you can see that there is a stream below from where the water is sourced to you. And there are buildings to which you will have to supply water. So if you want to think about the buildings as people you serve, and the stream there as a resources where you kind of build up your emotions. What happens in leadership very often, and for leaders, is that we keep giving to others and our emotional resources get depleted. And it's not just an emptying out of positive emotions, it's a gathering of negative emotions. And that's what makes emotional wellness extremely important for us leaders. So the second reflection point for you is this. Leadership challenges drain your emotional fuel tank. It leads to fatigue, frustration, health problems, psychological disturbances, bouts of anxiety, and mood swings. What is your emotional fuel tank like today? Do you feel depleted? Is there negativity? Are you kind of working with these challenges that you're facing because of the pandemic? Do you have enough reserve? Think about that while I move into my third point. So let's go back over the 2 points that I've made so far. The first is that as leaders, we have personal beliefs that always compete against leadership truths, and that leads to negative emotional responses. And these negative emotional responses kind of deplete what I would call our emotional fuel tanks. And I'm trying to use as many simple metaphors as possible because I don't want this to be a hardcore neuroscience lecture. I'm going to move into my next reflection point, and that's a question that we asked earlier on in the beginning of the webinar. Why do leaders neglect their wellness needs? And for this, we are going to set out a poll for you. So I'd like you to answer this poll. You'll see a poll coming up on your screens right now. There are 4 questions, 4 responses. They are multiple choice with multiple answers. So you are free to tick any of those or all of those. That's up to you. Why do leaders tend to neglect their wellness needs? Great. I can see that you've started responding to the poll, and I hope that most of you out there can see the poll. Thank you. The poll is like really picking up speed at the moment. So I know that your prefrontal cortex is like really active this morning. I'm going to pause for a couple of seconds for you to do this poll. And I can see the responses coming in from all of you. All right, I can see that you're answering the poll, and I let you do that. And going to my third reflection point for you. For most of us as leaders, neglect may start from a good place, but ends up badly for leaders and for the team. This is like an oxymoron or a paradox of leadership. And let me explain what I mean by that. Neglect may start from a good place, but ends up badly for the leaders and the team. What do I mean by neglect may start at a good place? Number one, leaders are so invested in what they do. And I think that's a good thing. As leaders, we want to invest in the lives of others. But when we do that, we don't prioritize our well-being needs. This was one of the poll statements. And this is why I said leadership and emotional wellness and the challenges of emotional wellness may actually start from a good place, because leaders are interested in investing in others. Secondly, one of the things that leaders do is that we serve as punching bags for the frustrations of our team members, but we don't create adequate supports for others. And you and I know that very well. In leadership, a team is always looking for one person to blame, and that's usually you, the leader. If something goes wrong, you'll have to take the flak for it. If there are frustrations that team members go through, you'll have to set aside your frustrations and your challenges and be there for them. So we are punching bags for them, and that's a good thing because we need to be there for them. But what happens is that we do not have adequate supports for ourselves. There's nobody that we can go and punch. There's nobody that we can go and share with. We also do this. We mask our vulnerabilities and we portray our strengths. One of the leadership truths that I spoke about earlier on today was the fact that we are role models de facto. And when we are role models de facto, we are expected to portray a particular kind of behavior or personality. I need to be calm all the time. I need to kind of not flutter, not show my emotions. I can't get upset. I can't get angry. I can't get frustrated, and so on. Well, that might help, provide those whom we lead with a sense of confidence in our leadership. But research world over has shown us that leaders who can portray their vulnerabilities are better leaders. Here is an example of how our strengths and vulnerabilities can actually work in tandem for the benefit of emotional wellness. I've taken examples from a popular assessment tool, which is called the Clifton Strength Finder. I've taken 4 strengths. If you are a kind of leader who's an achiever, someone who likes to do things, always looking to set higher standards, then one of your vulnerabilities is that you can be prone to fatigue. You can use that vulnerability positively. You can turn that fatigue around. When you're tired, taking a break and reminding yourself that it's perhaps not possible to achieve everything that you've decided to achieve. So that's reality check for you. Look at the other 3 strengths that I've placed before you on the screen. If you're like me, someone who wants to learn through every situation, I've been reading a lot about online learning and teaching in the last 2 or 3 months. Ever since the pandemic, I spent a whole days just going through literature. I want to learn and I want to kind of see what I can do, but I get frustrated sometimes when I realize that what I learned cannot be implemented. So I want you to pause for a while and ask yourself, what are some of your strengths that you have? And what are the vulnerabilities associated with that strength? And how can you use your vulnerability to improve your strength and your strength to remind you of your vulnerability that you're human. Finally, in this section on why I think neglect comes from a good place is the expectation that those whom we lead have from us. 21st century leadership is highly demanding. The students that we serve today, highly demanding. We've been getting emails from students saying we don't want to do exams, we don't want this, we want to do that, so on and so forth. We have professors that we work with who are extremely demanding. And research from social and emotional learning tells us the kind of leaders who do very well in situations of conflict, stress, and crisis are leaders who have high emotional intelligence, who are authentic, self-aware, empathetic, and manage our emotions well. But if you need to do this, then you need to have a strong resource pool of positive emotions. So going back to a concept of the emotional fuel tank, if your emotional fuel tank is depleted, then it's not very easy to be a leader who can manage others with empathy, self-awareness, and authenticity. Let me close the poll for you right now and share those results with you. And you should be able to see the results of the poll, which is a summary of this section that I did with you. Why do leaders tend to neglect their wellness? And I hope you can see the results. Viveka, are the results visible? Yeah? Okay. Far too invested in others. 47% of you say that. 28% of you say avoid addressing their vulnerability. Another 47 under pressure to be there for the team. Another 23, we consider emotionality as a weakness, and that's about vulnerability. And 26 of you say leadership is considered separate from the rest of life. And I think all these are reasons why we neglect our wellness needs. But like I said before, it all comes from a good place because we want to do something for those whom we lead. So what does your emotional balance look like today? Is it full or is it empty? Think about it. Make a note in your journal if you like. And when you go back from this webinar, think about that a little bit more. And I'll give you some tools in the last part of my presentation on what we can do to kind of fuel up our emotional fuel tanks, if I may use that metaphor. So what have we done so far? We've looked at 3 reflection points. The first reflection point, how does personal beliefs compete with leadership truth? Second, how is your emotional fuel tank? Is it full of positive emotions? Are you refueling it, or is it depleted? And what are the reasons why they're depleted? And number 3, leadership, emotional wellness, and a lack of emotional wellness or a neglect of emotional wellness often comes from a place of good intentions. And can you recognize those, kind of turn that around so that you can focus and reprioritize your emotional wellness needs? The 4th segment of our reflection today, and this is the last segment, I would like to introduce some tools to help resource ourselves and improve our emotional wellness. This slide is a summary slide on the risks to emotional wellness. Personal beliefs that compete with our leadership truths. I've picked out loneliness because in literature, one of the biggest risks for the neglect of our emotional wellness is the loneliness that leaders go through. It's an inescapable fact of leadership. And it's important for leaders to embrace loneliness and find ways in which we can make meaning out of that loneliness. Loneliness in leadership is never going to go away. Third, energy loss. I spoke to you about how the prefrontal cortex is constantly working overtime. I just looked at my telephone and emails this morning when I woke up, and I noticed that there are 40 emails from a group of students who are complaining about something that is happening with somebody in the university. And then I noticed that there are deadlines that I have to fulfilled. There are some, examination reports that haven't gone in on time. So there's a lot of work that's going on mentally in the mind of leaders that leads to constant energy loss. We're also constantly avoiding vulnerabilities. And the more I say that I'm okay, everything is fine, I don't want to show my emotions, I don't want to show how angry I am or how frustrated I am, the more I'm going to neglect my wellness. This week, I'm going to speak to some of my colleagues about something that I'm angry about. And that's going to be a challenge for me. But I think I should do it, because if I don't do that and I don't show them I'm human and explain to them why I'm angry about what I'm angry, and then help them to understand its implications on what we do at the university, I think I'm not being an effective leader. I think I can sleep better, I can feel more purposeful and meaningful if I do that. But in this last segment, what I really want to work with you is a tool to deal with what I call as thinking viruses. All forms of health, and usually physical health, and today for us, in the time of the pandemic or the corona pandemic, one word that has hit us very strongly is the word virus, right? For leaders like us, there are certain viruses that often impact our wellness, and I call them as thinking viruses. I'm trying to get the pointer option here, and I should be able to get it right here, right? So let me talk you through this rather complex looking slide, and let me talk you through this and then give you some time to do a reflection later. Remember this statement right on the top. This is a leadership truth. Leaders cannot please everyone. All right? So that's a truth, that's a context that we are working in. Now comes the human part. There is a crisis, or there is a team meeting, and there's a disagreement among the team members. What I should really be thinking is, I cannot please everyone. My job here as a leader is to ensure that I can work this out, problem solve, get some consensus. Maybe some of you may not agree with me, but that's okay, and so on. However, remember the personal competing belief? Well, what that does is that it makes me as a leader evaluate the situation through a filter of negativity. And so when team members do not agree with me, I start thinking, I'm an ineffective leader. Perhaps I fail as a leader. Perhaps people don't like me anymore. Do you see the negativity in those statements? Those are examples of what I call as a thinking virus. All of us as leaders are prone to thinking viruses. Some of us have more of them, some of us have less of them. Most of the thinking viruses surface when there is an external crisis event. So perhaps you're thinking about laying off faculty in your university. Perhaps there's a crisis that has come up. You don't know what to do about your online teaching. Maybe there are complaints from students and parents. These are crisis events. And the way leaders evaluate those crisis events against leadership truths will tell you if there are thinking viruses that impact the way you think or not. What thinking viruses do is that they mediate your emotions and leads to emotional disturbance, like being sad, lonely, rejected, so on and so forth. So these are the symptoms of the thinking viruses. Let me pause for a minute and just give you a couple of seconds to go over this once more, because this can be a complex slide, and this is like psychology jargon that we use a lot in psychology, and it's easy to pick up. But for those of you out there who are not used in the anatomy of thinking, let me talk you through this once more. There are external crisis events that kind of trigger thinking viruses in all of us. The thinking viruses will not be triggered if we are constantly appraising ourselves of the real leadership truth. That's realistic belief. If we give in to the thinking viruses, if you don't have enough emotional antibodies, then it's likely that we will feel sad, rejected, upset, and so on. Again, depleting our emotional resources. The example that I put for you in the previous slide, I'm an ineffective leader, is an example of a thinking virus that I call as personalization or blame. These thinking viruses have names, just like the COVID-19 or any other virus that we know about. Thinking viruses have names. And here are some names of common thinking viruses. I don't want you to spend too much time figuring this out, because I'm going to send you links later through United Board to resources that can explain what these thinking viruses are. And the picture I've placed for you there is a picture of clearing weeds out of the ground. But what I want to do is to give you a couple of seconds to look at the text on your screen and ask yourself which of these thinking viruses you are most accustomed to in your life as a leader. There's all or none labeling, jumping to conclusions, personalization blame, emotional reasoning, should statements, discounting the positive, that's my favorite virus, overgeneralization, all or none labeling. So look at the slide for a minute. And if you have your paper with you or your phone, you can take a snapshot of the slide and you can look at that later. There are many more thinking viruses, but I've selected a few most common thinking viruses for you. In a time of crisis, what is your style of thinking? Do you tend to see things in black and white? Do you tend to personalize and say, I am responsible for this? Do you want to jump to conclusions and say, hey, this is probably, they don't like me anymore, I'm going to get fired because of this? Just discount the positive. The webinar went well, but because of the disturbance in the background, this was a flop. That's called discounting the positive. Or things should be the way they should. I must always listen to the feedback of students, and otherwise things are not going to work. These are called thinking viruses. So if you had time to kind of take a picture of this, I'm going to do a poll for you right now. And I'm going to ask you, what are the most common thinking viruses that you experience? So let me go over to poll number 2 and then launch that poll for you. And I hope you can see my screen. And I want you to kind of tick the most common thinking viruses that you experience in times of conflict, crisis, or stress. Well, you're not having all this all the time. It kind of gets activated during a time of conflict or crisis. And I can see some of you are very much like me. Personalization and self-blame seems to be the highest. So that might be something very common about leaders, right? Just to think about it. That's interesting. I've not done this kind of research before, but you won't believe it. Personalization and self-blame is the top thinking virus that you have prioritized today, followed by should statements. That goes well with leaders, right? Because we want to see things happening in a certain way, and we kind of get affected if we don't. Viveka, do I have 5 minutes more?
Yes, Tony.
I have 5 minutes more. Okay, great. While the poll is going on, how can you deal with thinking viruses? So I picked up a term called emotional antibodies. I haven't put the name of the person who created this word. When I was preparing for this webinar, I got this bright idea. Let me introduce the word emotional antibodies. And I Googled it and I found that a medical student from China, but studying in the United States, has actually coined the term emotional antibodies, Dr. Chu. I think all of us can do with some emotional antibodies. And how can I kind of generate emotional antibodies for myself? I had a set of like 6 points to do that, but I took that off the webinar today because I think that's too much information. But I want to introduce you to one model I think that will work very well as a tool, and then we can work on more models later. This is a model from a evolving therapeutic approach called the acceptance and commitment therapy approach, which considers that human beings and us as individuals, ourselves, need to be addressed with kindness and curiosity. Leading by the self is a theme of this webinar series. And if we are leading ourselves, then the first attitude that we must have towards leading ourselves is an attitude of kindness. It's important to be kind to ourselves. Psychologists often like to evaluate and judge people. And a lot of psychological models in the past have taken that attitude. I like this because this is positive, this is wellness oriented, and it's very human. So the first part of this exercise, and you can kind of take a picture of this and make notes for yourself. The first quadrant that I want you to look at is the quadrant of personal values. What values do you want to express the most in your leadership? Here's an example that I've written for you. My personal value is perhaps to inspire and make a difference. All of us as leaders have values that we want to project through our leadership. So to inspire and make a difference is an example of a value that I've placed for the purpose of this exercise. Now, remember those personal beliefs, competing beliefs, and those negative, those thinking viruses and all that? That's the second quadrant. The unhelpful inner stuff that takes us away. It takes us away from accomplishing what we initially hope to accomplish, right? So what might show up inside of you? Example, your thoughts, your feelings, your moods, your urges, right? And here is an example for this particular person that we are working with. I want people to value my opinion, to invite me to important meetings. When they don't, I feel slighted. I want my department to be the best, and I feel insecure and angry when things are not perfect. So these are inner, unhelpful inner stuff, their thoughts, emotions, feelings. You can give it whatever name you want. What we need to focus on if you want to improve our emotional antibodies is to see what might you be seen to do if you were hooked up by unhelpful inner stuff. Well, if you have unhelpful inner stuff, you will be seen as someone who's checking on the decisions of your staff all the time, belittling your colleagues, pushing your department too hard, becoming a perfectionist, and so on. If you want to build antibodies, then you want to ask yourself, what do you do so that you can express, you can be seen to be expressing your emotion, your personal values in ways that are positive? So what should I do if I want to inspire and make a difference among my team? Accept my levels of competence. I can't be the greatest inspirational leader ever. Be authentic with my team. Be human. Be open to different points of view. Coach my staff because that's what they need, not micromanagement, not nitpicking, and be collaborative with other departments. So that's a model that I want to leave with you today. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds. I know my time is just running out. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to just look at this model, take a picture if you can. If you Google Ross McIntosh, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, or ACT, you will get a link to this PDF, and Ross will share this with anyone who wants to use this to improve yourself or your leadership or yourself. Here is a blank sheet. If we had time, we would do this exercise, but we keep that for another day, another time, or for your post-lunch, or perhaps this evening just before going to bed, and you want to distract yourself from something more pressing, then you might want to do this exercise. Let me conclude this webinar by sharing with you a last tool from a model by Myers and Sweeney, the only evidence-based tool that has been researched well enough for us to understand which part of our life we need to pay attention to if we have to be emotionally well. This model is called the Indivisible Self, and I chose this model because it resonates well with United Board's philosophy of whole person education. When you look at this model, You probably will be wondering, why is thinking emotions here, and why is realistic belief under the coping self, and why is it looking this way? It's because this is a research-based model. It's based out of factor analytic research, and tells you what areas of your life you need to pay attention to if you want to be emotionally well. So look at this, and this is rather self-explanatory. Our emotional wellness is filtered through our spirituality, our gender identity, through our self-worth, through exercise and nutrition, the most commonly spoken about tools for better wellness. And I think it's overdone a lot. Friendship, love, positive humor, and so on. Let me wind up this webinar, because I've taken more time than I should have, by leaving you with a final poll, and that is an area in your life, in all these areas that I've placed before you on this PowerPoint, that you think you need to pay attention to. And you can use that as your personal action plan for improving your emotional wellness. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Viveka. Thank you, colleagues, for listening to this webinar, and I hope it's been helpful for you. I will send you some of these links and materials through United Board. If you'd like to get in touch with me, Viveka asked me to share my contact details, so that's here for you on the screen. You can reach me through my website or through the email, my university email, or through my personal email. But I should say thank you very much for listening in today, and I hope some of what I said will be helpful for all of us as we journey through the uh, life of being a leader, investing in others, and shaping the world for a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.